So this whole Greenland thing is getting kind of out of hand.
Well, President-elect Trump is putting the world on notice about his intentions to acquire Greenland.
Floating the idea of the U.S. acquiring Greenland, which is a Danish territory.
He said he would tariff Denmark at a very high level if it does not give Greenland to the United States.
Donald Trump says owning Greenland is an absolute necessity. He wouldn't rule out ordering U.S. soldiers to take it by force.
Well, we need Greenland for national security purposes. I've been told that for a long time, long before I even ran.
That got attention from Denmark, to which Greenland technically belongs.
Greenland is not for sale. Greenland will never be for sale.
But then Trump's son, Don Jr., actually flies to Greenland.
We're really excited to be here.
He gives out a bunch of MAGA hats, takes some pictures. Republicans are even making this a House issue. This is a draft bill authorizing Trump to negotiate for the acquisition of Greenland by the United States, and it's called the Make Greenland Great Again Act. I'll be honest, it's mostly aspirational, but what explains this obsession that goes back to Trump's first presidential term in 2019?
Donald Trump abruptly and on Twitter canceled a planned state visit to Denmark, apparently because the Danish Prime Minister didn't want to talk about Greenland and selling it to the United States.
Even tweeting, tongue-in-cheek, that if it happened, he wouldn't do this.
I'm going to give you the top 4 potential reasons Trump wants control of Greenland, some of which make a lot of sense. But we'll start with number 4, and we'll work our way to number 1. Okay, so I hesitate to even include this because it's a bit silly, but I keep seeing references to this notion that maybe Trump thinks Greenland is much bigger than it actually is. And for this book, a few years ago, The Divider, Trump, so he's giving an interview to the authors, and on the subject of the US owning Greenland specifically, he says, "I love maps, and I always said, look at the size of this. It's massive. That should be part of the United States." Greenland is the biggest island on Earth. Except it's nowhere near as big as most people probably think it is. These 2D maps that we see all the time, where Greenland's bigger than Canada, they're what's called a Mercator projection. Just a very clever way of showing the Earth as if it's been unwrapped from a globe and then spread out flat. But because that wouldn't unfurl into a perfect rectangular map, what we're actually doing when we flatten the world out in this way is stretching things out, the farther away from the equator you get. Meaning the actual size of countries in real life is more like this. Note, Greenland shrinks down to be more like the size of Mexico. And yes, it's clear when you look at our actual globe, Greenland and Africa are not the same size. Far from it. I won't belabor the point, but you can go to thetruesize.com and see this effect for yourself. It's kind of cool how different countries and territories shrink and expand in real time as you move them up and down. Anyway, does Trump want Greenland because it's massive? Maybe, but it's reason number 4. It's worth noting that Trump wasn't the first American, or even the first American president, to think of acquiring Greenland. In the 1940s, just after the Second World War, the Truman administration saw Greenland as a military necessity. This map from a 1947 edition of Time magazine does a really good job showing how Greenland was seen as a strategic buffer between the US and Russia. Then, too, the US was told Greenland isn't for sale. But even today, the island is still seen as a defensive bulwark.
The shortest route from Europe to North America runs through Greenland.
Russia is a major Arctic player. It has, by far, the largest share of Arctic territory planet-wide. Almost a quarter of its territory is north of the Arctic Circle, and it controls 24,000 kilometers of Arctic coastline. Over the past few years, it has been steadily building up its military presence in the area, investing in air bases, naval ports, icebreaker fleets, upgrading its submarines.
Up here on the top of the world, there is a vast expanse of ice and of emptiness. And yet Russia has made deploying its military up here to these extreme conditions a real priority.
So through this lens, we can understand Trump's claim that controlling Greenland might be an issue of national security. But Trump demanding ownership of Greenland, perhaps to use as a shield against Russia?
The consensus seems to be that military necessity does not explain this, in the sense that the US already has a lot of what it needs to get out of Greenland militarily.
Right, because it ignores two facts. One, that Greenland already has a cooperation agreement with the US, specifically on military issues. And two, the US already has a permanent military presence on Greenland. It's called the Bidufik Space Base.
It's more focused on the surveillance of space, satellite tracking, and listening stations, and also early warning of any attack on the North American mainland. It's part of the US early warning system, and it's focused on maritime surveillance.
If you're imagining a world where you have more militarization happening between Russia, China, the European Union, even Canada and the United States, you're talking about a region, a quite large region that needs quite intense surveillance at all times.
Bidufik is formally part of the US Space Force. It has dedicated warning squadrons whose main job is to track and provide intel on incoming threats in real time. So yes, there is strategic value in Greenland, which could explain why Trump wants full control of it. But as it stands, because Greenland already counts the US as part of its own defensive backbone, military power is only reason number 3.
Global tensions find a new stage in the warming Arctic.
The Arctic is no longer a low-tension region.
The Arctic is opening up. These thick blocks of ice are melting, clearing the way for ships to travel through.
By the middle of this century, there will be no polar ice cap at the height of summer.
That's a big deal, because right now, the fastest way to ship goods from Europe to Asia is through the Suez Canal in Egypt. But, as we've seen more and more, the Suez Canal is not always the most reliable route.
A giant container ship ran aground in the Suez Canal after losing power.
Civilian shipping in the Red Sea has become more collateral damage to the war in Gaza.
So what if, instead of going down south and passing through the Middle East, you could go north and use the Arctic Ocean as a shortcut across the globe? There are essentially 2 ways you could do this. One is using what's known as the Northwest Passage. This would take you through the Arctic on the North American side, weaving through Canada's northern archipelagos. The other route through the Arctic is known as the Northern Sea Route. This one passes through the Russian side of the Arctic Ocean along the Siberian coastline. Both of these routes offer a much shorter path between Europe and Asia than the Suez Canal. It shaves off up to 5,000 kilometers. That's a third of the trip, or up to a full week of travel. And Greenland sits right in between these 2 routes.
The Arctic is melting very fast, and new shipping routes are becoming available all the time through what used to be just solid ice year-round. This is a channel that has just recently become sort of available year-round and is rapidly opening to Chinese shipping.
It isn't necessarily just about controlling that yourself. It's also about preventing others from controlling it. It's about preventing others from using it. The Chinese or the Russians, who are increasingly interested, for example, in shipping through the Arctic, the US would like to take away from them the opportunity to be able to buy their way into Greenland.
We should remember Trump's stated goal of owning Greenland is with a very specific type of security in mind.
I can say this, we need them for economic security.
Economic security, which trade would clearly fall under, hence being reason number 2. But there is another type of economic security that we haven't mentioned yet, and it is perhaps what best explains Trump's obsession with Greenland. There's an old joke in real estate, which is, you should buy land because they're not making it anymore. Except, in Greenland's case, this idea that melting ice is uncovering new land, that's immensely valuable, especially when you consider what's underground.
So Greenland does have enormous reserves of rare earth metals.
Greenland has known deposits of rare earth minerals that are about equivalent to the entire United States. And that's just the known deposits.
These minerals are incredibly strategically important, especially for the development of green technologies.
The thing to understand about Greenland is that it is potentially a crucial foothold towards a global green revolution. The energy transition away from fossil fuels and into things like wind turbines and electric vehicles. That's powered by a small group of what are called critical raw materials. Things like lithium, cobalt, nickel, graphite, copper, titanium, phosphorus, and then a whole bunch of rare earth elements with memorable names like dysprosium and ytterbium. China is the undisputed leader of the critical raw materials supply chain, accounting for something like 60% of the entire world's production of rare earth elements. But Greenland has these things too. Check out the results of this geological survey from a research group there. Deep underground, on that frigid island, there's lithium, cobalt, nickel, graphite, copper, titanium, phosphorus. And here's exactly where you can find them, largely untapped in the millions of tons. The world is beginning to notice this. From the European Union's executive arm, 25 of the 34 critical raw materials identified by the Commission as strategically important for Europe's industry and the green transition can be found in Greenland.
You'll see the same minerals in things like flat screen TVs, you'll see them in cell phones, and you'll also see them in a lot of military applications, guidance systems, sensors and tracking systems and so on. And so these are important minerals for the future. Greenland, it is known, has a pretty large supply of them.
Part of the strategy here may well be to try and get the U.S. foot in the door when it comes to exploiting those minerals before China or other powers can.
And Trump will be aware Greenland is on China's radar. It has clear intentions of digging up Greenland's hoard of buried treasure. Oh, and in case the minerals don't do it for you, there's also oil. The U.S. Geological Survey figures billions of barrels of oil just offshore.
People really don't even know if Denmark has any legal right to it. But if they do, they should give it up because we need it for national security.
So the 4 reasons I've outlined, or maybe just this one reason, explains the core of Donald Trump's stated desire to own and control Greenland. Whether you can do it, that's a whole other question. But it is worth noting, for years, Greenland has been looking for investors to help tap its potential wealth. And that is something the incoming American president knows how to do.